name.
Marco Rubio has the president's ear on many issues, including Cuba and Venezuela. We sat down with him late this week before the events in Charlottesville for a wide-ranging interview.
Good morning, Senator. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
We're very happy you're here.
I'm happy to be here.
Senator Rubio, we are in the midst of this furious war of words between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, and it seems to get ratcheted up every day. Today, the president tweeted out that military solutions are now fully in place, locked and loaded, should North Korea act unwisely. This is a really perilous moment.
Yeah. So first I'd say that I understand that, you know, from the sort of public media perspective, the war on words is frightening, right? It looks like maybe we're escalating it. And my style would be different. I imagine almost anyone's style would be different. The president is clearly unorthodox. The flip side of it, though, is it has no practical impact, in my view. And Kim Jong-un wants a nuclear weapon and the ability to attack the United States for one very simple reason. It is an insurance policy. He looks at what happened to Saddam Hussein. He looks at what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. He believes he's going to wind up in the same place unless he has a nuclear weapon. He believes that's the ultimate insurance policy. He's not interested in conquering Japan. He's not interested in invading California. He's interested in being a dictator for another 50 years. And the insurance policy that keeps the United States from, or anybody from coming after him, is a nuclear weapon. That's not going to change whether Donald Trump is nice to him on Twitter or mean to him on Twitter.
But can we reconcile ourselves? I mean, we did with Russia and China developing nuclear weapons, and we somehow worked out an accommodation. Is there an accommodation that's possible with Kim Jong-un?
I find that to be very difficult to imagine for a couple of reasons. The first is those were systems. The Chinese Communist Party, the Soviet Communist Party, they were systems. They had multiple leaders. And at the end of the day, they were pragmatists in how they made their decisions. In essence, the Soviet Union didn't believe they could win a nuclear war. Kim Jong-un is an unstable individual. He's someone who has grown up his entire life the son of a dictator, the grandson of a dictator. So his psychology is one of someone who makes decisions in a very different way. And to have not just nuclear weapons, but ballistic missiles that can reach the mainland of the United States in the hands of someone like this is an unacceptable risk in my view. And the question really is, you know, how do you keep him from reaching that point, and what do you do about it if he gets close to it? And so obviously, I don't speak about this cavalierly. And all military options in North Korea bring incredible costs. You know, a massive attack against Seoul would cost the lives of potentially millions of people. But I think the moment is coming where Americans are going to have to make a decision, and our leaders, about whether we are willing to accept not just a nuclear North Korea, but one capable of striking the United States. It's a risk I believe is unacceptable.
You know, to your point, the instability of the North Korean regime, when the American people are seeing on Twitter locked and loaded or fire and fury, the American people are frightened. I'm sure you see that when you speak to your constituents. And yet then you see Secretary of State Rex Tillerson saying, hey, scale back, nothing to worry about. Is there a policy? What should American people know about what the U.S. policy is? You had a Senate Foreign Relations Committee on this very subject. Well, what is the policy?
So I think what the policy is in some ways not different from what it's historically been, which is the United States is not seeking to go in militarily and overthrow Kim Jong-un. I mean, it would be great for the North Korean people to have a different leader, but the policy of the United States is not, we're not going to invade them for that purpose. I think it's also the policy of the United States to make abundantly clear that any sort of military act against the U.S. or its allies would be met with swift and decisive force. In essence, and I've said this before, and Kim Jong-un has to know this, the day he attacks America will be not just the last day of his life, but the last day of his regime. And I just think the president made abundantly clear in a tweet what everyone involved in this policy knows, and that is that if he ever attacks, it'll be one of the last things he does.
The North Korean generals, however, put out this unusually detailed statement saying in the middle of August we're going to send 4 intermediate-range missiles near Guam. Now, that would be certainly an aggressive act. Is that the kind of act that would necessitate the kind of huge response?
There's no doubt that if he were to launch anything that threatened U.S. territory or a U.S. ally, it would be met with a response. Obviously, it would be calibrated to meet the threat. But in the end, one thing we have to understand about Kim Jong-un is he didn't have a lot of people around him that give him differing opinions. This is not a person who travels the world. This is not someone who processes or receives information the way you do or I do. There is always the risk that he is overconfident and miscalculates and does something that goes beyond what he knows what the response is going to be.
We've heard a lot of people comparing this to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62. Do you see that?
No, I think it's different. I think it's actually in some ways more dangerous. We had an established link of communication with the Soviets. At the end of the day, the Soviets were pragmatists about, they didn't want a nuclear war either. They understood no one was going to win that exchange. And Khrushchev ultimately looked for an out in that policy, and the Kennedy administration created a vehicle by which he could get an out while saving face. And it was one of the factors that ultimately cost Khrushchev his post, was the way that went down. This is different. I mean, there is no established channel. He doesn't have a Politburo he's responding to. He's a one-man show. This is not a person who is processing information the way even Khrushchev did back in 1963. This is an individual that's incredibly isolated and unstable. And so it's a very risky situation. It's almost kind of something out of a Madman movie. I mean, it's frightening, but it's a reality.
Talking about what the U.S. response should be, I'm sure, as you said, only the President, Commander-in-Chief can do that. But, you know, we have seen these scenarios where the missile launching bases in North Korea are targeted, their nuclear facilities, and then you start thinking 26 million people live in Seoul. There are a couple of 100,000 United States, 23,000 military people, by the DMZ, 40,000 troops in Japan. I mean...
No, there's no doubt. I mean, there's no good options here. There's not some easy solution to this problem. This is not Iraq in 2003 where you could basically obliterate them in weeks. This is not that kind of thing. There's no doubt. I think the likeliest escalation involves some sort of attack on South Korea. South Korea would respond with overwhelming conventional capabilities. Then the North Koreans would escalate that, and at some point could then threaten the lives of Americans. And there's where you think you could see. You know, you talk about the soldiers and American servicemen and women in South Korea they're on the armistice line. In some ways, it's terrible to say, but they're a tripwire force. In essence, they are attacked. That trips a wire that involves an additional American action. As far as the particular military options before the president, I know he has them. Obviously, those aren't discussed publicly. But he has a variety of options and a sequence of escalation that doesn't involve all-out war at the back end.
Senator, let's move on to Venezuela, a subject very dear to your heart. You've been right at the center of the discussion and the policy discussion. What's it going to take to restore Venezuela to a democratic state?
A free and fair election. I mean, that's the bottom line. That's all it's been asked for. There's no guarantee that the winner of that election is going to be pro-American or vote with us at the UN or the OAS. But that's what the Constitution of Venezuela calls for. And what Maduro and the people around him have done is they've suspended that process because they know they can't win. What really complicates things in Venezuela is these individuals around Maduro, many of them are implicated in all sorts of crimes, both against their own people and drug trafficking and money laundering. So they're fearful that a future government would extradite them to the United States. So they are basically in a no man's land where they're kind of backed up against the corner. On the other hand, you've never seen such regional unity like you have right now.
17 Latin American nations just
speaking out without even the U.S. at the meeting. So they did it on their own, and so it shows an incredible amount of regional unity. And I think one of the reasons for that is you have to think this out into the future. If they are able to pull this off, where they've basically nullified a constitutional democracy and replaced it with a Cuban-style system, you now have an oil-rich nation that over time is going to try to replicate that and support elements like that. Colombia, in Honduras, in Guatemala, they already have that in Nicaragua. You're halfway there in El Salvador and potentially in Mexico with Obrador. And suddenly, within 5 years, you could have an arc of anti-democratic, anti-American forces stretching from Venezuela all through Central America for the most part and right up to the U.S. border. And that's why you see some of these nations so intently involved in this effort. They understand this is part of a broader objective in the long term. It too is concerning.
So you had tweeted out then it's time for significant economic sanctions. So what does that mean practically speaking? Tougher than on individuals as
So there are sectors of their economy that do nothing to benefit the people, but are most definitely benefit the regime. So the reason how Maduro's keeping that country together at this point is he has tens of thousands of people that are loyal to him, not of ideology. They're loyal because their families still remain in a privileged position. They used to get cars and houses, and toothpaste, but it's still more than what the average Venezuelan is getting. When he can no longer provide that for them, that's the glue that holds this together. And it would cause a lot of them to say Maduro's no longer worth the trouble. And so there are sectors that allow us to, people always speculate about oil, but one of the things you have to understand is the way that Maduro's carrying this out is he sells these oil bonds, and he's selling them at a discount. So $1 million worth of bonds for $400,000. And then he takes the $400,000 in cash, and that's just a number I'm making up. That's not the actual number, but he takes $400,000, 8 or 9% of that, he spreads it out to keep regime loyalty, and the rest he pays the interest on the existing debt.
Yeah.
So 6 months later, he can come back out to the credit markets and do it again.
We're going to take a quick break. We're going to pick up where we left off with Senator Rubio and turn to Cuba and tax reform when we come right back. Take on the crisis in Venezuela. A Sunday when we were on the air, actually there was a little uprising, a little spark of a rebellion at one of the military bases. We've had people talk to us and say there is no hope for any sort of protest to go anywhere, no opposition to go anywhere without military force. What do you make of that?
Yeah.
Where is that going?
Well, to me, I think one of the more frightening scenarios is when there reaches a point where the anti-Maduro or pro-democracy people in the country feel like they have only two options because they lose trust in their opposition leaders that are in the National Assembly. Let's say they lose any trust in them because this notion that somehow these opposition leaders control the street is not true. They don't. I mean, they can convey, they can convene, but ultimately the people on the street are very angry and have a series of grievances against the government. So when these people reach a point where they feel like there's no hope through our elected National Assembly, there's only two ways forward: armed rebellion or asylum. And both of those have severe implications. The armed rebellion, of course, would involve violence and loss of life and instability. And asylum would involve, thousands of people that are fleeing the country to Colombia, to Brazil, obviously to the United States. So that's my biggest fear, is that they lose hope. If the world's attention turns away, the problems still exist. And what is going to be the escape valve for the opposition, and I fear will become civil war, which we don't support. We don't want a coup d'etat. I don't want a military coup d'etat in Venezuela. I want them to have an election. I want them to have an election for president. I want them to have an election for governors and regional councils the way the law requires it. And they're not going to do that in a fair way because they can't win one.
So this week, the Miami-Dade Commission had voted to, well, on a lot of different components to a resolution, but really the only practical aspect was to encourage the administration to offer temporary protected status to Venezuelans now, TPS, just like Haitians, Salvadorans, Hondurans have. Is that something that you would be in favor of with what's going on?
Generally, I am. And I mean, I think you can't deport someone back to a situation like that, especially if they fear for their lives. I think the bigger problem, though, is if you talk to Venezuelans, while they would welcome TPS in the short term, they want to be Venezuelans. They want to live in Venezuela, and they don't want this to have to be necessary. So I think it's an issue we'll have to confront, because otherwise you're going to have people here that are going to overstay because they're not going to go back, and then you're going to face a situation where are we going to really deport them back to that system.
We learned this week about this disturbing incident last fall in Havana where these powerful electronic listening devices were used by somebody, maybe the Cubans, maybe the Russians, maybe both, and a couple of U.S. diplomats had severe hearing loss, and a Canadian diplomat as well. What do you make of this?
I hold the Cubans 100% responsible. I don't care what the nationality was of the individuals that harmed our people. This is one of the most tightly controlled societies in the world, certainly one of the most tightly controlled societies in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba is not a place where people can move around and do whatever they want without someone knowing about it. So either they did it, or they know who did it and didn't prevent it. But I hold them responsible for that, and we should hold them responsible for that. And now the Canadians have come out and said they had someone harmed as well.
Right. Well, in the government, the Trump administration, Treasury, and other departments are in the process of writing the rules and regulations for this revised policy towards Cuba. Will this incident have an impact on what those rules and regulations
Well,
say?
certainly if we can identify the individuals or entities responsible for it, they would be among the sanctioned entities. But by and large, I think it reaffirms the need for it. And to understand this change, because there's been a lot of reporting on it that's not fully accurate, I think I would know, since we were certainly involved in helping to craft it. The purpose of this regulation, the purpose of this change in policy, is to ensure that to the extent Americans are traveling to Cuba and spending money there, they are spending as much of it as possible directly with individual Cubans and their small businesses. You know, one of the selling points of the Obama policy was that they had this surging entrepreneurial class. I said, great, then let's empower them. by putting them in a privileged situation versus Gaesa and the military-owned entities. You've seen already the Cuban response has been to crack down on the entrepreneurial class, but for the first time in many years, the Cuban people now know that the reason why they can't own a business has nothing to do with the United States. It has to do with the Cuban government.
Tax reform has been on your agenda, been on the congressional agenda, the president's agenda, but if you fail to repeal and replace Obamacare, how do you move on to tax reform?
Well, I would say two things about it. One of the things that made Obamacare repeal and replace so difficult is we don't have one insurance market. We have 50 plus individual territories. Right. Every state has its own dynamics, both how it handles Medicaid and how it handles the individual market. Tax reform, federal taxes are the same everywhere. So I think that's the one. The other is a lot of these ideas are not even partisan. I think both sides agree that our business tax rates need to be made more competitive. The debate is about what do you do with the money that it should generate, because or how do you pay for it if it costs you money. The part of it I'm most focused on, I'm in favor of all the business stuff, but the part of it I'm most focused on is increasing the child tax credit. If you look at what working families are spending per child today, you know, we've been having these roundtables across the state. There are families that are making $800 a week and spending $300 on child care. It's an extraordinary cost, and so we want to have a tax credit that's easier to use, bigger, to account for the growth and the cost of raising children, and by the way, more focused on people that may not even have an income tax liability, because if they make less than a certain amount of money, the primary tax they pay is FICA. We want it to apply against the payroll tax.
Senator Marco
Great
Rubio,
to have you here.
Great to have you in. Thank you very much.
Thanks for doing this.